Sir, step out of the vehicle.
Officer, I can't just step out like
What do you
that.
mean you can't?
I'm disabled. I need my crutches.
I gave you a lawful order. Step out now.
I'm trying to tell you, I can't
Hey,
stand when
hey, wait, stop resisting.
I'm not resisting. I can't stand.
At 4:08 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon in Maricopa County, Arizona, the wide residential streets of Clearwater Ridge were doing what they always do at that hour, cooling down slowly from the desert heat. Sprinklers clicking on across manicured front lawns, the last of the school pickup traffic thinning out as families disappeared behind closed garage doors, and the neighborhood settled into that particular late afternoon quiet that feels from the outside like everything is exactly as it should be. The kind of neighborhood where the homeowners association meets quarterly, where the property values get discussed at dinner parties, where people feel, without ever saying it out loud, that they know who belongs here and who doesn't. Marcus Webb, 34 years old, was driving home. He had made this exact drive 47 times since moving to Clearwater Ridge 8 months earlier. Same route every time, same turn signal at the same intersection, same slow roll past the same houses, past the same driveways with the same expensive cars sitting in them, toward the end of Saguaro Crest Lane, or a welcome mat his sister bought him still sat slightly crooked next to his front door because he hadn't gotten around to straightening it yet. It was the kind of small, unfinished thing you tell yourself you'll handle over the weekend. Marcus had been telling himself that for 3 weeks. He was tired. Not the ordinary tired that comes from a long workday, though it had been a long workday. The particular exhaustion Marcus Webb carried was something different, something accumulated, the kind of tired that lives in a body that fights itself constantly, in a left leg that ends 4 inches below the knee and is replaced every single morning by a prosthetic that fits well but never perfectly, never without that specific awareness in the hip and lower back that reminds you, hour by hour, that something is missing that used to be there. The kind of tired that lives in shoulders that absorb twice the mechanical load they were designed for, in a nervous system that learned, in a trauma center in Landstuhl, Germany, to operate in a state of permanent low-grade alert, in a mind that spent years in environments where relaxation was a liability and stillness was dangerous, and has never fully received the message that those environments are behind him now. His forearm crutches were in the back seat, standard positioning, right where he placed them every morning when he got in and right where he would reach for them every time he got out. That was the routine. That was the system. After everything Marcus Webb had been through, systems and routines were how you kept moving forward when moving forward required more from you than it requires from most people. The windows were down. The radio was low. The desert air coming through the car smelled like warm concrete and cut grass and the faint trace of someone's backyard grill firing up early for the evening. There was no reason, not one single articulable reason under any statute, any municipal code, any standard of professional law enforcement practice for what was about to happen. But reason was not what Officer Dale Hutchins was operating on when he eased out of the side street and fell in behind Marcus's black Dodge Charger on the last quarter mile before Saguaro Crest Lane. The body cam activated at 16:08:11, and everything that follows, every word, every movement, every decision made in the next 7 minutes is preserved, permanently, in devastating frame-by-frame audio-enhanced clarity that would eventually be reviewed by federal investigators, dissected by civil rights attorneys, presented to a grand jury and played for a courtroom that went completely silent the moment it began. What that footage documents will cost the Maricopa County Sheriff's Department $11 million. It will cost Officer Dale Hutchins his badge, his pension, and his freedom. It will trigger a federal civil rights investigation that uncovers a pattern of racially discriminatory policing spanning 6 years and involving documentation that his supervisors had actively worked to suppress. It will result in reforms that the department had been told repeatedly by community organizations, by civil rights groups, by officers within the department itself were necessary years before Marcus Webb ever turned onto Saguaro Crest Lane. All of that is coming. But before this story goes a single second further, drop your city in the comments right now. Wherever you are watching from tonight, I want to see it. We have people tuning in from across the country, and I want to know where this one is landing. And if you believe, genuinely, not as a political position, but as a basic principle, that a badge is not a license, that a uniform does not place anyone above the law, that accountability is not optional when it becomes inconvenient for the people who are supposed to be accountable, then subscribe right now, because that is what this channel is built on. And what you are about to watch is one of the most completely documented, thoroughly captured on camera examples of what real accountability looks like when it finally arrives. Now, back to that street, back to that camera, back to that moment. Because before you can understand what Officer Dale Hutchins took from Marcus Webb on that Thursday afternoon, what he attempted, what he assumed, what he so casually and completely disregarded the moment he stepped out of his patrol car, you have to understand who Marcus Webb actually is. Not who Hutchins decided he was in 3 seconds from behind a windshield. Who he actually is. Because the distance between those two things is not a gap, it is not a discrepancy. It is a chasm so vast that when the full reality of it finally landed inside that courtroom, there were people in that room, experienced attorneys, veteran law enforcement officers, a judge who had presided over hundreds of civil rights cases, who had to look away. Marcus Webb was born in Tucson, Arizona, the second of 4 children raised by a single mother named Patricia Webb, who worked double shifts as a night shift nurse at Banner University Medical Center for 22 years without complaint, without exception, and without ever once allowing her children to use the difficulty of their circumstances as an excuse for anything. Patricia Webb was the kind of woman who believed, completely and without irony, that the content of your character was the only thing in this world that genuinely belonged to you. She instilled that belief in all 4 of her children with the same quiet, relentless consistency she brought to everything else in her life. Marcus was an exceptional student, not the kind of exceptional that comes easily, the kind that comes from sitting at a kitchen table after a full day of school while your mother sleeps 4 hours between shifts, working through problems that don't make sense yet, because you understand, even at 12 years old, that the only way out of a small apartment in South Tucson is through that page. He graduated high school in the top 8% of his class. He received a partial academic scholarship to Arizona State University. He enrolled in September of the year he turned 18, declared a major in civil engineering, and spent 2 semesters doing exactly what everyone who knew him expected him to do. Then, 9/11 happened. Marcus Webb was 19 years old. He sat in a campus common room and watched the towers fall on a television screen surrounded by 200 other students who were all watching the same thing, and something inside him resolved with a clarity he would later describe as the only moment in his life where a decision did not feel like a decision at all. It felt like recognition, like something that had already been true becoming visible. He enlisted in the United States Army 3 weeks later. He completed basic training at Fort Jackson, South Carolina. Advanced individual training followed. He qualified as an infantryman, then pursued and received additional training that led to his assignment to the 75th Ranger Regiment, one of the most elite light infantry units in the United States military, an institution that demands from its members a standard of physical and mental performance that eliminates the vast majority of candidates before they ever reach it. Marcus Webb did not just reach it, he exceeded it. His evaluations during the selection process described a soldier with exceptional situational awareness, uncommon composure under pressure, and a capacity for leadership that his instructors noted as rare at his experience level. He deployed to Afghanistan in 2004, then again in 2006, then again in 2008. 3 combat deployments, 14 months total in theater across those rotations. Operations in Kunar Province, in the Korangal Valley, in areas of eastern Afghanistan where the terrain is so unforgiving and the engagement so frequent that entire military careers are defined by a single rotation there. Marcus Webb did 3. He was awarded the Army Commendation Medal with Valor Device for his actions during a 2006 engagement in which his unit came under ambush, and Marcus, then a staff sergeant, organized and executed a flanking maneuver that neutralized the threat and enabled the extraction of 2 wounded soldiers who would not have survived if the engagement had continued at its original trajectory. The citation uses careful, formal military language that compresses what was by every account of the men who were there an act of extraordinary courage under conditions that would have paralyzed most people entirely. He was awarded the Bronze Star. He was recommended for the Silver Star following his 3rd deployment, a recommendation that was processed, approved at the unit level, and then delayed by administrative backlog in a way that Marcus Webb himself, when asked about it years later, would describe with a single-shouldered shrug and the words, "That's the Army." The kind of equanimity that only comes from a person who has decided at a very deep level that recognition was never the point. The point, for Marcus Webb, through it all, was the mission, the people to his left and to his right, the standard. The injury happened in 2009, during his fourth and final deployment. A vehicle-borne IED on a road in Kandahar province that his convoy should not have been traveling at that hour, but was traveling because the mission required it, and the mission always required something. The explosion was significant. The injuries to Marcus were severe and immediate and required emergency surgical intervention that began in the field and continued through a medevac to Bagram and then to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany, where he spent 11 days in intensive care while surgeons worked to save what they could and reconstruct what they couldn't. His left leg was amputated below the knee 3 days after the explosion. He was 28 years old. The rehabilitation that followed at Walter Reed, then at a VA facility in Phoenix, then in outpatient sessions that continued for 2.5 years, was, by Marcus Webb's own account, the hardest thing he ever did. Harder than ranger selection, harder than 3 combat deployments, harder than the moments in the field that earned him medals, because all of those things, difficult as they were navigated with a body he knew, a body he had trained and pushed and trusted completely. Rehabilitation meant learning a new body, learning new patterns of movement, new tolerances, new ways of doing things he had done without thought since he was a child. It meant confronting every single day the gap between who he had been and who he was now, and deciding every single day without the option of taking the day off from that decision to keep going anyway. He kept going. By 2012, Marcus Webb had completed his rehabilitation program, earned his degree in civil engineering from Arizona State University, the degree he had put on hold 11 years earlier to enlist, and accepted a position with a private infrastructure firm based in Phoenix that specialized in federal contract work. By 2019, he had been promoted twice, was managing a team of 14 engineers, and had purchased the house on Saguaro Crest Lane in Clearwater Ridge after 2 years of careful financial planning and a mortgage application process that his loan officer later described as the most thorough documentation package she had reviewed in 17 years of practice. He had a home gym in the spare bedroom. He coached youth flag football on Saturday mornings at a park 3 miles from his house, working with kids between 8 and 11 years old, teaching them not just the mechanics of the game, but the habits of discipline and accountability and respect for the people around you that his mother had taught him at a kitchen table in South Tucson. His neighbors knew him, not in the vague wave from the driveway way that passes for community in a lot of suburban neighborhoods, actually knew him, had been to his backyard, had borrowed his tools, had brought him food during a week in March when his back was bad enough that leaving the house was difficult. Marcus Webb had lived on Saguaro Crest Lane for 8 months. He was 47 seconds from his own driveway when Officer Dale Hutchins' lights came on behind him. No siren, just the lights, red and blue strobing across the quiet street, catching the windows of houses on both sides, drawing the attention of the 2 neighbors who happened to be in their front yards at that moment, both of whom would later provide statements to federal investigators describing exactly what they saw and exactly how it began. Marcus did what he always did in a situation requiring calm and precision. He followed his training. He checked his mirrors, he signaled, he pulled over smoothly to the right shoulder, came to a complete stop, put the car in park, and placed both hands on the steering wheel in a position of maximum visibility, hands open, fingers spread. He had been taught by the Army, by years of operating in environments where the wrong movement at the wrong moment had consequences that could not be undone, that in any high-stakes encounter, the most important thing you could do was remove ambiguity. Make your intentions clear. Give the other person nothing to misinterpret. He was in his own neighborhood. He had committed no traffic violation. He had done nothing. Officer Dale Hutchins had been with the Maricopa County Sheriff's Department for 9 years. His personnel file, which would become one of the most scrutinized documents in the subsequent federal investigation, told a story that his supervisors had made a deliberate institutional choice to ignore. 14 civilian complaints over 7 years. Not 14 minor procedural grievances, 14 complaints that included allegations of racial profiling during traffic stops, claims of excessive force during arrests involving Black and Latino suspects, and multiple documented accounts of Hutchins conducting what investigators would later classify as pretextual stops, stops with no legitimate law enforcement purpose, initiated not because of any observed violation, but because of the race of the driver and the perceived affluence of the neighborhood they were driving through. Every single one of those 14 complaints had been reviewed internally. Every single one had been dismissed, not investigated by an external oversight body, not referred to the department's Civil Rights Division, not escalated to the county attorney's office, reviewed internally by supervisors who reported to the same chain of command as Hutchins, and dismissed with language that the federal investigators would later describe in their formal report as boilerplate exoneration, unsupported by documented inquiry. His direct supervisor, Roy Caffey, had signed off on 11 of those 14 dismissals personally. Caffey's own performance reviews of Hutchins during this period described him in 3 separate annual evaluations as proactive in identifying suspicious activity in residential patrol zones. The federal investigation would later establish that this language was Caffey's standard notation for officers who conducted high volumes of pretextual stops in wealthy neighborhoods, a practice that Caffey had apparently decided was good police work, regardless of the racial demographics of who was being stopped, or the complete absence of any legitimate law enforcement basis for the stops themselves. His partner on the day in question, Officer Jeremy Kowalski, had his own file. 6 complaints in 4 years, 4 of them involving racial profiling, all dismissed. He and Hutchins had been partnered together for 18 months. In that 18 months, their joint patrol data showed a stop pattern that a statistical analyst retained by the federal investigators would later describe under oath as not explainable by any factor other than the race of the individuals stopped. In the 18 months they worked together, Hutchins and Kowalski initiated 94 traffic stops in Clearwater Ridge and 3 adjacent affluent residential neighborhoods. Of those 94 stops, 81 involved Black or Latino drivers. Of those 81 stops, 6 resulted in citations. 6. The remaining 75 produced no citation, no arrest, no evidence of any violation, nothing except a record of a stop that was initiated, conducted, and closed without legal justification. This was the pattern. It was documented, it was visible to anyone who looked at the data. Multiple community advocacy organizations had looked at the data and presented it formally to department leadership. A civil rights organization had submitted a detailed written complaint to the county attorney's office 18 months before the stop involving Marcus Webb. An officer within the department, a 12-year veteran who later became one of the federal investigators' cooperating witnesses, had raised concerns about Hutchins' behavior in an informal conversation with the lieutenant that was, according to that lieutenant's subsequent testimony, not documented, not investigated, and not followed up on in any way. Nobody acted. Nobody looked closely enough, or cared enough, or felt enough institutional pressure to do what the situation required. And so, on a Thursday afternoon in October, when Officer Dale Hutchins spotted a black Dodge Charger being driven by a Black man through the streets of Clearwater Ridge and decided in the 3 seconds it took him to register what he was seeing that something was wrong with that picture, there was nothing in the institutional architecture around him that was positioned to stop what he was about to do. He pulled out, he fell behind Marcus Webb, he activated his lights, and the body cam, which was equipped with a 30-second pre-event buffer, captured everything from the moment he made the decision to the moment Marcus Webb's hands went up on the steering wheel. Hutchins approached the driver's side window. His body language, visible in the footage, showed none of the procedural caution that law enforcement training prescribes for an unknown stop situation. The positioning, the awareness, the deliberate approach. He walked directly to the window the way someone walks toward a conversation they have already decided how it ends. His expression, captured clearly by the body cam in the afternoon light, was not the neutral professional face of an officer initiating a routine stop. It was the face of someone who had already arrived at a conclusion. He asked Marcus to step out of the vehicle. Not, "Can I see your license and registration?" Not, "Do you know why I stopped you?" Not any of the standard procedural openings that exist precisely because they create a record of justification for the stop itself. He asked Marcus to step out of the vehicle, immediately, before a single word had been exchanged, before any identification had been requested or provided, before any traffic violation had been named, because there was no traffic violation to name. Marcus remained calm. His hands stayed visible. His voice was level. He told the officer that he had a disability, that he needed his crutches to exit the vehicle safely, that his crutches were in the back seat. He said it clearly. He said it calmly. He said it the way a man says something he expects to be heard. Hutchins looked at him. Then Hutchins told him to step out of the vehicle again. The crutches were visible. From where Hutchins was standing, with the angle of the body cam confirming his sightline, the forearm crutches in the back seat were visible through the window. Not obscured, not ambiguous, visible. Hutchins told him to step out again. Marcus attempted to explain again with the same deliberate calm that without his crutches he could not safely exit the vehicle, that his prosthetic leg required the support of the crutches to manage the movement from sitting to standing, that he was not refusing, that he was asking for the accommodation that the law, specifically the Americans with Disabilities Act, which applies to law enforcement interactions in which every officer in the Maricopa County Sheriff's Department had been trained on as a mandatory component of their certification, requires. Hutchins reached for the door handle. What followed was captured by the body cam, by the dash cam on Hutchins' patrol vehicle, and by a residential security camera mounted above the garage of the house on the corner of Saguaro Crest Lane that covered a field of view extending 30 feet past the point where Marcus Webb had stopped his car. 3 angles, simultaneous, all of them running. Hutchins opened the door. He made physical contact with Marcus Webb, grabbing his arm, pulling forward, before Marcus had been given any opportunity to retrieve his crutches, before he had been given any opportunity to stand, before he had been given any opportunity to do anything other than exist in a car that he owned, on a street where he lived, in a neighborhood where he had every right in the world to be. Marcus lost his balance. Without the crutches, without his left leg making full contact with the ground, the physics of the situation were not complicated. He lost his balance. He went down. Not a fall that could be described as dramatic or violent in the way action sequences in films are dramatic and violent. A slow, awful, unavoidable descent. The kind that happens when a body is placed in a position it cannot recover from without the tools it depends on, and those tools have been denied. He went down to the pavement of Saguaro Crest Lane. His prosthetic leg was visible. The crutches were still in the back seat. Hutchins stood above him and told him to stop resisting. Marcus Webb, a decorated combat veteran who had survived 3 deployments in an IED in Kandahar province and 2.5 years of rehabilitation, and every single morning of choosing to keep going when keeping going required more from him than most people are ever asked to give. Marcus Webb was lying on the pavement of his own street, 47 seconds from his own driveway, being told to stop resisting while his body tried to do what a body without its necessary equipment does when it has been pulled from a vehicle without warning. 2 of his neighbors were watching. One of them was already on the phone. Not calling 911, calling someone else entirely, someone whose name and number they had, because Marcus Webb was the kind of neighbor who introduced himself, who showed up, who made sure the people around him knew who he was, and who had, over 8 months on Saguaro Crest Lane, made sure that a few key people in his life knew how to reach each other if something ever went wrong. Inside that call, a name was spoken. And the moment that name was spoken to the person on the other end of that phone, the moment the situation was described, the location given, the body cam footage confirmed to be running, something began. Something procedural and institutional and absolutely unstoppable. Something that Officer Dale Hutchins, still standing on the pavement of Saguaro Crest Lane with no idea that his career had already effectively ended, could not have anticipated and could not have prepared for, even if someone had tried to warn him. The machine activated. Hutchins had Marcus Webb in handcuffs within 4 minutes of the initial stop. He walked him to the patrol vehicle, slowly, awkwardly, because Marcus on pavement without crutches required a physical process that the footage documents in full. He placed him in the back seat. He and Kowalski got in the front. The patrol car pulled away from Saguaro Crest Lane. In the back seat, Marcus Webb sat in handcuffs, wearing the button-down shirt he had worn to work that morning, his prosthetic leg visible, his expression, captured briefly in the interior camera of the patrol vehicle, showing something that the people who later watched that footage described not as anger, not as fear, but a very specific kind of knowing. The expression of a man who understands exactly what is happening, exactly why it is happening, and exactly what it means. He had seen enough of the world to recognize this moment for what it was. He also knew something that Hutchins did not. He knew who had been called, he knew what was coming, and he knew, with the same quiet certainty that had guided him through ambushes in Kunar province and rehabilitation corridors at Walter Reed and every hard morning since, that the only thing left was to wait. Hutchins, meanwhile, was talking. The interior camera captured the conversation in the front seat as the patrol car moved toward the Maricopa County Sheriff's Department's West Valley substation. Hutchins talked about the car. Nice car for someone who supposedly lives around here. He talked about the neighborhood. He made comments that the federal investigators would later describe in formal language as demonstrating a clear racial animus that was consistent with the documented pattern of behavior in the officer's complaint history. He said things that once transcribed and read aloud in a courtroom would cause multiple jurors to visibly react. Kowalski said very little. His silence was its own document. His choice to say nothing, to offer no correction, no pushback, no acknowledgement of what was plainly visible about the situation, would be examined in its own right during the investigation. Complicity, the federal civil rights statute makes clear, is not a passive condition, it is an active one. Kowalski had been in that car for 18 months. He had seen the pattern. He had made his choices every single time it played out. He had made them again. At the West Valley substation, the booking process began in the way booking processes began everywhere, with an intake officer, a desk, a computer, a form. The intake sergeant that afternoon was a 20-year veteran named Sandra O'Fara, a woman whose institutional memory of the department was long enough and whose professional instincts were sharp enough that the moment Marcus Webb was walked through the door, something registered as wrong. She looked at him. She looked at the body cam on Hutchins' chest, which was still recording. She looked at the way Marcus carried himself, despite the handcuffs, despite the obvious difficulty of moving without his crutches, despite everything. She looked at Hutchins. She asked what the charge was. Hutchins told her, suspicious activity, failure to comply with a lawful order. Sandra O'Fara had been doing this for 20 years. She knew what suspicious activity meant when it appeared on a form without any supporting detail. She had seen it before. She knew what it was shorthand for. She ran his name. The first thing that came back was his service record, not because that was unusual, veteran status appears in certain database queries, but because the service record that came back from Marcus Darnell Webb was not the kind of service record that appears every day. The decorations, the deployments, the ranger tob, the commendations. She ran his address, Saguaro Crest Lane. She looked at Hutchins again. Then she picked up the phone. She did not call dispatch. She did not call the watch commander. She called the number that had been left 40 minutes ago by a neighbor on Saguaro Crest Lane on the department's non-emergency community line, a number that had been left with a specific instruction. If anyone calls asking for a Marcus Webb, transfer immediately. Do not place on hold, transfer immediately. The call connected. The voice on the other end had a title, the kind of title that changes the temperature of a room when it is spoken out loud. The kind of title that when, attached to the name of the man currently sitting in handcuffs in the intake area of the West Valley substation, recontextualized everything that had happened in the past 47 minutes so completely and so irreversibly that the institutional foundations of the case against Marcus Webb did not crack, they dissolved. Sandra O'Fara listened. She asked 2 questions. She received 2 answers. She set the phone down and turned to look at Officer Dale Hutchins with an expression that Hutchins would later, in his own testimony, describe as the moment he understood that something had gone very wrong, though he would not say what he understood had gone wrong, because the answer to that question was not something Dale Hutchins ever voluntarily acknowledged with complete honesty. What had gone wrong was simple. He had stopped the wrong man. Not in the moral sense, though that too categorically and completely, but in the specific procedural, career-ending, institution-shaking $11 million sense. He had stopped a man whose identity, his record, his connections, and his thorough documentation of every moment of what just happened created a legal exposure that no amount of internal complaint dismissal, no amount of supervisory protection, no boilerplate exoneration language could address or absorb or make go away. The handcuffs came off Marcus Webb in the intake area of the West Valley substation 43 minutes after they had been put on in his own neighborhood. Sandra O'Fara removed them herself. She apologized, formally, directly, in the language of a professional who understood exactly what had happened and was not going to pretend otherwise. She said the words that Hutchins did not say on Saguaro Crest Lane, that Kowalski did not say in the patrol car, that not one person in the institutional chain that produced and protected and enabled Officer Dale Hutchins in 7 years of complaints and dismissals and pattern data and community advocacy and internal warnings that went nowhere. She said this should not have happened. Marcus Webb looked at her. He thanked her. Then he asked for his crutches, which had been retrieved from his vehicle and were leaning against the wall near the intake desk. He placed them under his arms. He stood and said quietly and clearly and in a voice that the intake camera captured in full that he would be speaking with his attorney that evening and that he wanted all documentation, all footage, all radio communications, and all records related to the stop and the booking preserved completely and immediately. The federal investigators arrived at the West Valley substation 2 hours and 14 minutes later. They arrived because the name that had been spoken on that phone call 40 minutes earlier, the name attached to the title that had changed the temperature of the room, had made 3 phone calls of their own after speaking with Sandra Okafor. 3 calls to 3 different offices, each of which had set its own process in motion. By the time Hutchins drove home that night, 6 separate federal and state processes were already active. He did not know this. He would not know it with full clarity for another 11 days, when the certified letter arrived and the reality of what he had done became impossible to avoid. The investigation that followed was comprehensive in a way that investigations involving ordinary civilians rarely are, because the resources brought to bear on it were extraordinary, and because the documentation was extraordinary, and because Marcus Webb, who had spent his entire adult life understanding that preparation and precision are the only things that stand between you and chaos, had, without ever anticipating this specific situation, structured his life in a way that produced evidence at every turn. The body cam footage, the dash cam footage, the residential security camera, the neighbor's phone recording, the interior patrol car camera, the intake area camera at the West Valley substation, the radio communications, the dispatch logs, the database query records showing exactly when Sandra Okafor ran Marcus Webb's name and exactly what came back. And then the investigative data, the 94 stops, the 81 Black and Latino drivers, the 6 citations, the 14 complaints, the 11 dismissals signed by Kaffe, the 3 performance reviews describing Hutchins as proactive, the 18-month pattern analysis, the statistical report concluding with a probability figure that the analyst would later describe in testimony as effectively 0, that the racial disparity in the stop data was the product of chance. Sergeant Roy Kaffe was notified of the investigation on day 3. He retained an attorney on day 4. The criminal indictments came down 4 months after the stop on Saguaro Crest Lane. Officer Dale Hutchins was charged with deprivation of civil rights under color of law, unlawful detention, assault, violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act under a federal enforcement mechanism that carries criminal as well as civil penalties, conspiracy, because the investigation had established through the radio communications and the pattern data and the testimony of the cooperating witness inside the department that what happened to Marcus Webb was not an isolated incident or a momentary lapse in judgment, but the most recent and most thoroughly documented expression of a practice that had been ongoing and had been known and had been protected. Officer Jeremy Kowalski was charged with civil rights violations and conspiracy. His cooperation with investigators was described by the lead federal prosecutor in a press conference that was carried live by 3 local television stations and picked up by national outlets as minimal and self-serving. Sergeant Roy Kaffe faced the most serious charges of any individual in the case: obstruction of justice, conspiracy,
supervisory failure to investigate civil rights violations, a charge that the federal statute reaches specifically and deliberately because the people who enable abuse of power are not separate from the abuse, they are part of it. Kaffe had signed 11 dismissals. He had written 3 performance reviews praising a pattern of discriminatory policing as proactive law enforcement. He had, according to the testimony of the cooperating witness, coached Hutchins on at least 2 occasions on how to document stops in ways that would not trigger the complaint review threshold. The trial lasted 4 weeks. The jury watched all of the footage, every angle, in sequence, then again in slow motion at the request of the defense, a decision that the defense attorneys later acknowledged in conversations that became part of the public record through subsequent civil proceedings, was a strategic error they recognized the moment the second screening began, and the jury's faces showed them exactly what they were seeing. They heard from Sandra Okafor, who testified for 3 hours about the moment Marcus Webb was walked through the intake door and what she observed and what she did and what she understood. They heard from the statistician, who presented the stop data in a format that required no interpretation. The numbers said what the numbers said, and what they said was not ambiguous. They heard from the cooperating witness inside the department, whose testimony about Kaffe's coaching sessions and the culture of dismissal that surrounded Hutchins' complaint history produced a silence in the courtroom that the court reporter later described as the longest sustained silence she had recorded in 19 years of proceedings. They heard from Marcus Webb. He testified for 5 hours over 2 days. He described his service, his injury, his rehabilitation, the house on Saguaro Crest Lane and what it had taken to get there and what it meant to him and what it meant to his mother, who was present in the courtroom both days and who sat in the front row of the gallery with her hands folded in her lap and her expression showing something that the reporters covering the trial struggled to find the right word for and eventually settled on across multiple outlets independently as dignity. He described the drive home, the lights in his mirror, the decision to pull over calmly and place his hands on the steering wheel, the explanation he gave about his crutches and the response that explanation received, the pavement. He described lying on the pavement of Saguaro Crest Lane in front of his neighbors' houses, 47 seconds from his own driveway, without his crutches, in handcuffs, being told to stop resisting. He described it in the same voice he used for every other part of his testimony, calm, precise, without embellishment and without deflation, the voice of a man who had decided at some point in the process of everything that had happened to him that the most powerful thing he could do was simply tell the truth exactly as it was and let the truth do what truth does when it is given enough room and enough documentation and enough of the right people finally paying attention. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 40 minutes. Guilty on all counts for all 3 defendants. Hutchins was sentenced to 9 years in federal prison. His law enforcement certification was permanently revoked. His pension was forfeited. His name was entered into the federal law enforcement malpractice database that prevents future employment in any law enforcement capacity in any jurisdiction in the United States. Kowalski received 5 years, same certification revocation, same database entry, same permanent bar. Kaffe faced 13 years. The judge, in her sentencing statement, used language that departed from the typically measured register of judicial pronouncements and moved into something more direct. She said that Kaffe's conduct represented not a failure of supervision, but an active choice, repeated, documented, and deliberate, to protect an officer whose behavior he knew, or should have known, was causing harm to members of the public he was sworn to protect. She said the sentence reflected the understanding that those who enable abuse of power bear a responsibility that is not diminished by the fact that they were not the ones who activated the bodycam. The civil lawsuit settled for $11 million. The settlement included, beyond the financial figure, a set of mandatory structural reforms that Marcus Webb's attorneys had insisted upon and that the department, by the time negotiations concluded, was in no position to resist. Mandatory external review of all traffic stops, independent civilian oversight with genuine investigative authority, body cam footage preservation requirements with tamper-proof protocols, quarterly public reporting of stop data broken down by race, neighborhood, and outcome, a pattern analysis mechanism that would flag officers whose stop demographics exceeded statistical thresholds and require mandatory review, not internal review, external review, before those officers could continue in their current patrol assignments. And one more thing. One requirement that Marcus Webb had personally insisted on, that his attorneys had made a non-negotiable condition of any settlement, and that the department had agreed to because the alternative was continuing litigation that they had no remaining capacity to win. His case, the footage, the testimony, the statistical analysis, the full documented record of what happened on Saguaro Crest Lane and what it revealed about the institutional conditions that made it possible became mandatory training material in every law enforcement academy in the state of Arizona. Required viewing, required study, required discussion, not as an example of what happens when one bad officer makes one bad decision, but as a case study of what systemic discriminatory policing looks like when it is fully documented, fully prosecuted, and fully held to account. Marcus Webb returned to work at his firm the week after the verdict. He returned to coaching flag football the following Saturday morning, 8s and 9s and 10s and 11-year-olds in a park 3 miles from Saguaro Crest Lane, learning the mechanics of the game and the habits of discipline and accountability and respect for the people around you. He showed up the way he always showed up, on time, prepared, present. His mother was at that practice. She sat in a folding chair on the sideline and watched her son move across the grass with his crutches and his prosthetic and his coaching clipboard and the same quality of attention he had brought to every hard thing he had ever done. And she did not say much about it because Patricia Webb was not a woman who needed to say much about things she had spent her whole life already knowing. The welcome mat at the end of Saguaro Crest Lane is still slightly crooked. Marcus Webb has not gotten around to straightening it. He will handle it over the weekend.
$11 million, 3 criminal convictions, 2 careers ended, 1 department reformed, and a man who survived Kandahar and Walter Reed and every hard morning in between, still coaching flag football 3 miles from home, still driving the same route, still turning the same turn signal at the same intersection. The cameras were running the whole time. They caught everything. Now, what do you think needs to change before a disabled veteran can drive home and his own neighborhood without fear? Leave your answer below. A real answer, not one word. Tell me what you think actually needs to happen, because the comment section on this video is going to be the most important part of it, and I want to read every single one. Share this story. Send it to someone who needs to see it. Put it on your page. Text it to somebody. Because accountability only works when enough people refuse to look away. And the reason this case ended the way it did is because enough people refused. And if you are not subscribed yet, this is the channel for stories like this one. Every week, documented, complete. Because the truth, when you give it enough room, is always more powerful than anyone who tries to suppress it.